The distress signal came through on a dead frequency. Nobody used that band anymore. It was old Coalition tech, the kind that got phased out 3 decades ago when the newer relay networks went live. Most species had stopped monitoring it entirely. Their equipment simply did not listen there. Human equipment did. It was not because humans were smarter. It was because the engineer who designed Earth Fleet's long-range receivers had grown up poor, on a colony where old parts were the only parts available. She had built redundancy into everything. Every frequency, every band. Dead or alive, her receivers listened to all of it. That habit had been copied into every human ship built since. So when the signal came screaming through the dark, bleeding and broken and barely coherent, it was a human relay station that caught it first. Lieutenant Demi Offer pulled the recording from the buffer and played it twice before she believed what she was hearing. Then she forwarded it up the chain without adding a single word of her own. Some things needed no commentary. Admiral Yara Osai received the file at her desk on Luna Base. She was in the middle of a budget review, which she closed without saving. She read the decoded transcript once, then pulled up the raw audio and listened to it herself. The voice on the recording did not belong to any human. It was multi-toned, layered, the kind of sound that came from a species with 2 resonating chambers in their throat. It was a Vethri voice. She realized Coalition Central Command, and it was terrified. 3 fleets gone, 6 weeks, 31 systems either fallen or cut off. The Vendra had come from the outer reaches of the galactic arm, and they had not stopped moving since. The Coalition was not losing the war. The Coalition had already lost it. This signal was not a call for reinforcement. It was a final transmission from a civilization trying to make sure someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to them before the silence came. Osai sat with that for a moment. Then she called her senior staff. Commander Drev was the first one through the door. He was not human. He was Vethri himself, one of the few alien officers embedded with Earth Fleet as part of a joint cooperation program that most of the Coalition considered more symbolic than practical. He had served with humans for 4 years. He understood them better than most of his own kind did, which was why his expression when he entered the room was not surprise. It was dread. He had already read the signal. "You're going to respond," he said. It was not a question. "I'm going to do more than that," Osei replied. She pulled up the star maps and started marking jump corridors. The front line, based on the last known positions in the signal, was 11 days out at standard Coalition cruise speed. Human ships did not travel at standard Coalition cruise speed. 7 days, maybe 6 if they pushed the drives. Drev watched her work. He had stood in this office many times and watched humans calculate things that other species had already decided were impossible. It still unsettled him, but not because it was wrong. It unsettled him because it was always right. "The Council did not route this signal to Earth," he said carefully. "They did not ask for your help." "No," Os agreed, "they didn't." "Then technically—" "Someone is dying out there, Drev." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I don't need an invitation to answer that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "What are you putting together?" "Battle Group Aegis, 47 ships." She marked the last jump point and leaned back. "Full combat load. I want the Iron Wall as flagship. Helm commands." Drev blinked. 47 warships was not a rescue party. It was not a peacekeeping force. It was a statement written in hull plating and weapons arrays. "The Council will not be pleased," he said. "The Council can be displeased from safety," Osai replied. "That's a privilege someone else is buying for them right now." She stood and walked to the wide viewport that looked out over the lunar surface. In the distance, the dry construction yards were lit up around the clock, the way they always were. Human shipyards never went dark. There was always something being built, repaired, rearmed. Other species had asked about that once in early diplomatic meetings. "Why do you always build? Why do you never stop?" Because we live in a dangerous universe, a human delegate had answered, and we learned that lesson the hard way. Osai thought about that now. Get Helm on the line, she said. Tell him to start the pre-jump sequence. We move in 4 hours. Drev stood, straightened his uniform, and moved toward the door. He paused once. Admiral, he said, if the Vendra have taken 3 coalition fleets in 6 weeks, then they haven't met us yet, Osai said simply. Drev left without another word. Behind him, Osai pulled up one last file before she began drafting the deployment order. It was an old record, centuries old, pulled from early human history. A general's quote, written before humanity ever reached the stars. It read, "The most dangerous thing you can do to a human being is convince them that someone innocent is suffering, and they have the power to stop it." She closed the file and started writing the order. 4 hours later, 47 warships left lunar orbit in formation and turned their noses toward the dark. The jump corridors between Sol and the front line were quiet, which was exactly how Fleet Captain Rudo Helm preferred them. He had been commanding warships for 19 years. He had fought 2 border conflicts and 1 full engagement near the Cashin Reach. He was not the kind of man who filled silence with noise. His bridge crew had learned that early. When Helm was quiet, it meant he was thinking. When he stopped thinking, he would talk, not before. He was thinking now. The sensor data from the distress signal had been fed into the tactical system and broken down overnight. The Vendra moved in dense swarm formations, thousands of smaller craft coordinated by a handful of command ships buried deep in the mass. They hit fast, overwhelmed point defense systems through sheer number, and used a disruption field that interfered with the phase resonance shielding that the Coalition had standardized across all their vessels. The Coalition had been fighting them with tools that did not work against them. That explained 6 weeks. That explained 3 fleets. Helm had read the full breakdown by the time Ambassador Karel arrived on the bridge requesting a meeting. Karel was the Coalition envoy who had been stationed on Luna Base for the past year, part of the same cooperation program that had placed Drev with Earth Fleet. He was tall, gray-skinned, with large, reflective eyes that gave him a permanently startled look. He was not startled now. He was deeply, visibly uncomfortable. Helm gave him a short tour instead of a meeting. It was more efficient. He started in the engineering bay, 2 decks below the bridge. The iron wall's drives were old by civilian standards, but rebuilt from the inside out. Every primary system had a secondary. Every secondary had a manual override. The power relays were tripled along the combat spine. Karel moved through it slowly, reading the labels on conduits and junction boxes, running calculations in his head that Helm could see playing out behind his eyes. "This is redundant," Karel said finally. "Yes," Helm agreed. "To this degree, it adds significant mass. It reduces speed and maneuverability by a measurable margin." "It does. Then why?" "Because when a system fails in combat, I want my crew to have 3 other options before they start dying." Helm moved toward the next section. "We've found that staying alive long enough to keep fighting matters more than the speed we gave up to do it." Karel followed him in silence. The weapons deck was next. Lieutenant Sira Mwangi was running a calibration cycle when they arrived. She was young, focused, and had the particular kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what every piece of equipment around her was capable of. She walked Karel through the iron wall's loadout with the same tone a person might use to describe a grocery list. Karel stopped at the 3rd item. "This is a mass acceleration cannon," he said, reading the panel. "That's right," Mwangi confirmed. "The Coalition banned mass acceleration weapons in the Reach Accords 200 years ago." "We weren't part of the Reach Accords," Mwangi said. Then, carefully, "We didn't have faster-than-light travel 200 years ago." Karel looked at Helm. Helm kept his expression neutral. We developed most of our weapons technology fighting each other, Helm explained. On one planet, for a very long time. The things that survive that process are the things that work. The ambassador said nothing for a long moment. Then he moved to the shield configuration panel and studied it. Your shields use a different resonance base, he said slowly. Yes. The Vendra disruption field targets the frequency the coalition uses. We checked. Mwangi pulled up the comparison data. Our base frequency is different enough that their disruption fields will have limited effect on us. Not zero, but limited. Karel stared at the display for several seconds. His large eyes moved across the numbers twice. Then he turned and looked at Helm with an expression that was harder to read than most human faces. Captain, he said, why does your species build ships this way? Helm thought about it for a moment. He wanted to give an honest answer, not a proud one. Because we come from a world that tried to kill us for 100,000 years, he said. Weather, animals, each other, disease, everything, and we're still here. When we started building ships, we built them the same way we built everything else. He paused, like we expected them to take damage. Karel was quiet for the rest of the tour. That evening, he sent a private message back through the relay to Coalition Command. Helm did not read it. He did not need to. He had seen that look before, on the faces of visiting officers from allied nations, the first time they toured a human warship and realized that what they were looking at was not aggression. It was preparation, long, patient, thorough preparation. There was a difference. Most people figured that out eventually. Mwangi found him at the forward viewport later, watching the stars stretch past in the jump corridor. Sensors are showing we'll be at the egress point in 19 hours, she said. Good. The Vendra fleet positioning from the last signal data puts their forward edge about 4 light hours past the jump point. I know. She stood beside him for a moment. Think they'll be surprised when we come through. Helm looked at the stars. He thought about the coalition fleets, 3 of them, gone in 6 weeks. He thought about the signal on the dead frequency that nobody else had heard. Yes, he said, I think they will. Mwangi nodded once and went back to her station. 19 hours later, the jump corridor ended, and 47 human warships dropped back into real space. What was waiting on the sensors made the bridge go silent. The Vendra fleet was not 4 light hours away. It was much closer than that. Captain Brix had made peace with dying. He had not wanted to. He had a family on the 3rd moon of Vethoru, a daughter who was learning to pilot small craft, a partner who kept a garden despite the thin soil. He thought about them often. But his engines were dead, his secondary drives were fused, and the Vendra forward edge was 40 minutes away at its current closing speed. His weapons were intact, which meant he could make the last 40 minutes count for something. That was more than some of his crew had gotten. He sat in the command seat of his crippled vessel, the Reliant Oath, and watched the sensor display. He had 14 crews still alive. They had done everything right. They had fought the way the coalition trained them to fight, in the patterns and formations that had worked for 200 years of peacetime patrols and minor conflicts. None of it had mattered. The Vendra swarm had gone through their fleet the way water goes through sand. Fast, total, without negotiation. Now the Reliant Oath drifted, and Brix watched the Vendra come. Then his sensor officer made a sound he had never heard from her before. A short, sharp intake of breath, like she had been surprised by something that had no category in her experience. Captain, she said, new contacts. Vendra reserve elements. No, they're coming from the opposite direction. A pause. 47 contacts, unknown configuration. Brix leaned forward, unknown. Not in any database I have. Hull geometry doesn't match coalition standard, doesn't match anything. Another pause longer. They're moving in formation. He looked at the display himself. 47 signatures, dense and organized, dropping out of jump space in a tight cluster. And they were not spreading out. They were not taking up defensive positions or forming a screen or doing any of the things that a fleet did when it arrived in contested space and needed time to assess the situation. They were already in attack formation. They had dropped out of jump, already knowing what they were going to do. The largest contact moved to the point of the wedge. The others arranged themselves behind it in two angled lines, like a blade. Then, without any visible pause for coordination or communication, the entire formation began moving forward. Not away from the Vendra. Toward them. Brick sat back slowly. "Who are they?" his sensor officer asked. He looked at the hull configuration data on the side panel. Thick armor plating, heavy weapon signatures, drive signatures that were slightly different from anything in the Coalition registry, and a signal tag, faint but there, broadcasting in a frequency he vaguely recognized from old Joint Cooperation briefings. "They're human," he said. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a moment. Then the Vendra commander sent its standard transmission. Bricks had heard it 3 times in the past 6 weeks, always just before the end. It was a simple signal, a mathematical pattern that translated roughly as, "You are surrounded, you are finished, stop moving and your end will be efficient." The human fleet did not respond. The human fleet accelerated. Bricks had spent 6 weeks watching the Vendra operate. He had seen them absorb everything the Coalition threw at them, adapt and close in without hesitation. They were not a force that reacted with panic. They were precise, mechanical, overwhelming. But when the human wedge hit their forward screen at full speed, something changed. The Vendra disruption fields went out across the human formation. Bricks watched it on his display, the same wave pattern that had dropped Coalition shields in seconds. He had watched it happen to 8 ships he knew personally. He closed his eyes briefly, expecting the human contacts to start going dark. They didn't. The human shields held. The human weapons fired. Not in a spread, not in a wide suppressive pattern. In coordinated, stacked volleys, each ship targeting specific points in the Vendra formation, the shots layering into each other to hit single targets from multiple angles at once. Bricks had never seen that before. It required every ship in the formation to know exactly what every other ship was doing in real time without error. The Vendra forward screen broke in less than 4 minutes. They reformed, which was what they always did. The swarm pulled back, regrouped, redirected. But the human formation didn't chase the broken pieces. It held its shape and moved toward the center mass, forcing the Vendra to come to them instead of choosing their own engagement angles. Bricks's sensor officer was tracking the exchange quietly, running numbers on a side display. She turned to him after a few minutes. "Their shields are absorbing the disruption fields," she said. "Different frequency base. The Vendra weapons are hitting them, but the damage rate is," she checked the numbers again. "It's much lower than what we were taking." "They knew," Bricks said, mostly to himself. "They came here already knowing how to fight them." One of his other crew members, a young navigator who had barely slept in 5 days, was watching the tactical display with wide eyes. "Captain," he said quietly, "they actually came." Bricks looked at the 47 contacts still moving forward, still holding formation, still punching into the mass of the Vendra fleet like they had decided the outcome before the first shot was fired. He thought about his daughter, learning to fly on the 3rd moon of Vethoru. "Yes," he said, "they did." He reached for the emergency repair controls and started running diagnostics on his secondary drives. He did not have much. But if there was any chance of getting the Reliant Oath moving again, he was going to take it. The humans had not come all this way to watch from a distance. He did not intend to either. The Vendra learned fast. That was the thing nobody in Earth Fleet had fully appreciated from the signal data. The tactical briefings had covered their swarm behavior, their disruption fields, their command structure. What they had not covered was the speed at which the Vendra adapted when something stopped working. Helm noticed it 11 minutes into the engagement. The disruption fields had failed against the human shields, so the Vendra simply stopped using them. They pulled their smaller craft back and concentrated their fire on a narrower section of the human wedge, targeting the same ships repeatedly instead of spreading their attacks. They were looking for a weak point. Every fleet had a weak point. You found it by hitting things until something broke. "They're focusing on the left flank," Mwangi reported. "Stonewall and Caro are absorbing most of it." The Stonewall was Captain Nils Brower's ship. It was one of the older vessels in the group, heavily armed but with plating that had already taken maintenance hits before deployment. Helm pulled up the damage feed. The Stonewall had lost hull integrity in 2 sections. Its port weapons array was operating at 60%. It was still in the line. He opened a channel. "Brower, your status." The response came back immediately, with the particular flat calm that Helm recognized as a man who had already done his calculations and accepted the results. "We're still in the line, Admiral. Port array is reduced but firing. Hull breach is sealed manually. We're good." "You're not good," Helm said. "You're damaged." "I know the difference between damaged and done," Brower replied. "We're damaged." Helm closed the channel and looked at the tactical display. The Vendra had committed the majority of their mass to the left flank pressure now. They could see the Stonewall was the weakest contact, and they were going for it with everything, which meant their right flank was the thinnest it had been since the engagement started. He studied the geometry for about 4 seconds. "Mwangi," he said, "take the farhold in the Perseverance off the right flank. Full thrust, wide arc around the outside of the formation." She looked at the display. He watched her work it out. "That leaves the right side of the wedge exposed." "Yes." "If the Vendra redirect." "They won't redirect, not yet. They think they're about to break our left flank. They'll keep pushing." He looked at her. "They haven't met humans before. They don't know that the ship that's half-broken stays in the line." Mwangi sent the order. Farhold and Perseverance peeled away from the formation in a wide arc, driving hard around the outside edge of the battle. From the Vendra perspective, it probably looked like a retreat. 2 ships abandoning the formation under pressure. The Vendra did not redirect. They pressed harder on the Stonewall. Brower's ship took 3 more hits. Another section lost pressure. One of his weapon turrets went offline entirely. He reported none of this. He just kept firing with what he had. Karel had been standing silently at the back of the Iron Walls bridge for the past 20 minutes. Helm had almost forgotten he was there. He heard the ambassador's voice from behind him, very quiet. "The Stonewall is going to be destroyed." "No," Helm said, "it isn't. It has lost significant capability. Any rational commander would pull back." "Brower isn't pulling back." "Why?" Helm watched the display. "Because we need him where he is for another 3 minutes. He knows that, so he'll be there for 3 more minutes." Karel was quiet. Drev, standing beside the ambassador, said nothing either. Drev had served with humans long enough to simply watch. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the Farhold and Perseverance completed their arc and came in from behind the Vendra formation. They hit the command cluster of ships that sat at the heart of the swarm, the vessels that coordinated everything, that translated swarm chaos into directed attack. The effect was immediate. The Vendra pressure on the left flank stuttered, then stopped. The smaller craft that had been hammering the Stonewall began moving in conflicting directions, some continuing the attack, some turning toward the new threat, some just drifting. Without the command ships driving the coordination, the swarm logic started to fracture. Helm opened the fleet channel. "All ships push forward, center mass now." The wedge moved. All 45 remaining functional ships drove into the gap that the confusion had opened up. The Vendra swarm tried to reform, tried to find its center, but there was nothing to reform around anymore. The pieces scattered, broke, and began pulling back. Karel exhaled slowly. How did you know the command ships were there? Swarm logic always has a center, Helm said. We just had to get behind it. We have used swarm counter-tactics before, Drev said carefully, from beside the ambassador. They never worked like this. You were trying to counter the swarm from the front, Helm replied. You can't untangle something by pulling on the knotted end. The Vendra retreat became real and steady. Not broken, not destroyed, but moving back, choosing distance. Brower's voice came over the channel. Stonewall reporting, still in the line. Helm allowed himself a single quiet breath. The battle had taken 31 minutes. The Vendra had retreated for the first time in 6 weeks. But Mwangi was already pulling up long-range sensor data, and what it showed made her go still. Captain, she said, this wasn't their main fleet. Helm looked at the numbers. The mass signatures further out in the system, behind the retreating force, were larger by an order of magnitude. The Vendra had not come to this system to fight. They had come to pass through it. Their real fleet was somewhere else entirely. The holographic council chamber looked exactly like the real one, which I found both impressive and irritating. Every seat was filled with a projected image. 23 species, 23 expressions of exhaustion and relief, all of them talking at once through translation filters that added a slight mechanical lag to every sentence. Os sat at the end of the long table in the Iron Walls conference room and let them talk for 4 minutes before she said anything. High Counselor Veth spoke the longest. He was a large, pale creature with slow movements and a careful voice that gave the impression of great wisdom managing great emotion. He thanked the human fleet 3 separate times. He spoke about the courage it took to answer a signal that was not addressed to them. He used the word unprecedented 4 times. Then he began discussing terms for a ceasefire. Osai stopped him there. Where are the Vendra now? She asked. Veth paused. The force that engaged you has retreated beyond the Vethara boundary, coalition observers believe. I'm not asking about that force, Osai said. I'm asking about the main fleet, the staging ground 3 systems further out in the Kora belt. The table went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of people who did not know she knew that. You have intelligence on the staging ground, one of the other council members asked. We have sensor data from the engagement. The force we fought was a forward element. The main fleet is assembled at a fixed installation in the Kora belt, approximately 9 light towers from our current position. She pulled up the data on the room's shared display. They have not moved. They are resupplying and processing data from this engagement. They will adapt what they learned today and come back in larger numbers. Veth studied the display carefully. How long do we have? Weeks, maybe less if they move fast. I kept her voice level. But that's not the point. The point is we know where they are right now, and we have a fleet capable of hitting them before they finish adapting. Veth exchanged a look with several other council members. It was the look of people who had a response prepared, but were deciding how to phrase it. Admiral Osai, he said finally, coalition doctrine does not permit offensive operations beyond established contact boundaries without a full council authorization process. The review period alone requires. How long is the review period? A minimum of 30 days. Osai looked at him. They destroyed 3 of your fleets in 6 weeks. You want me to wait 30 days to go after the installation that makes that possible? The process exists for very good reasons, Veth said. Offensive action without consensus carries risks that. Counselor, she was not unkind, but she was very clear. I understand your process. I understand why it exists, but I have to be direct with you. She folded her hands on the table. We came here because someone was dying and we had the ability to help. We pushed the Vendra back today. That is real and it matters. But if we stop here, if we let them sit in that installation and rebuild and adapt and come back, then everything we did today just bought you a few more weeks before the same result. What you are proposing is an unprovoked attack on. They started this 6 weeks ago, Osai said. What I'm proposing is finishing it. Drev, sitting against the wall behind her, said nothing. He had watched Osai work in rooms like this before. She did not need help. Veth was quiet for a long moment. Other council members whispered to each other through muted channels. Os waited. Even assuming authorization, Veth said slowly, a direct assault on a fortified installation of that scale would be difficult, Osai agreed. Yes, but the stone wall is still functional after taking fire that would have destroyed any vessel in your current fleet inventory, and we now have targeting data on the Vendra command structure. She looked around the table. We have what we need. The question is whether you want to use it. Another long silence. Then one of the other council members spoke. Not Veth. A smaller delegate, species that Osai did not immediately recognize, quiet up to this point. If the humans move on the installation, this delegate said carefully, and if coalition vessels accompany them, does that satisfy the intent of the authorization process? Several eyes turned toward the legal representatives at the far end of the table. The legal representative for the council took 17 seconds to answer, which Osai knew because she counted. Technically, accompanying an allied fleet in a defensive capacity against a known aggressor could be classified under Provision 12 of the Mutual Security Framework. Then I would like to offer my ship, the small delegate said. Osai looked at him. Who are you? Captain Brix, the delegate said. Reliant oath. My engines are repaired. A pause. Your flanking maneuver in the Vethara engagement was interesting. I would like to see it again from a better position. Osai studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Veth looked at the table, then at Osai, then at the display showing the staging ground in the Kora belt. He looked like a man who had arrived at a conclusion he had been trying to avoid. I cannot authorize this, he said. I know, Osai replied. She stood. Battle Group Aegis will jump for the Kora belt in 6 hours. Anyone who wants to come is welcome. She ended the holographic connection. Drev stood up from his chair against the wall. The council will file a formal objection. They can file it while they're safe, Osai said. That's still an outcome worth having. She walked out of the conference room and went to find Helm. 6 hours later, Battle Group Aegis jumped. Behind them, 11 coalition ships followed. One of them was the Reliant Oath, its engines running clean and its weapons fully loaded, flying in formation with the humans like it had always been there. Brix, it turned out, was a fast learner. The Kora belt was cold and dark, and absolutely full of things trying to kill them. The Vendra staging ground was not a ship. It was a structure, built into the dense debris field of an old asteroid cluster, layered in armor and defensive weapons, and positioned so that any attacking force had to come through a narrow approach corridor before they could get a clear angle on the core. It was designed to be held by a small force against a large one. Osai looked at the approach data and said, Brix, how well do you know debris navigation? Brix's voice came back over the channel. Well enough. There's a secondary approach on the southern rim of the belt. Tighter, but it avoids their primary coverage arc. If a smaller group of ships can get through it while we hold their attention from the front, they'll have a clear shot at the power relays on the structure's underside. A pause. How small a group? 4 ships, coalition-sized vessels, can manage the gap. Our ships are too wide. She pulled up the path on the shared display. You'd be threading it without a margin for error. Another pause, shorter. Send me the coordinates. That was the moment Osai decided she liked Brix. The main assault went in hard and deliberately loud. Battle Group Aegis hit the primary approach corridor at full speed, drawing every defensive weapon the Vendra installation had. The return fire was heavy. 2 human ships took significant damage in the first 3 minutes. They stayed in the line. The Vendra did not expect the attack from below. Brix led 4 coalition vessels through the southern rim of the belt in tight single file, following the path Osai had sent him, moving through rock and debris in the dark while the noise of the main battle covered their approach. He had spent 6 weeks watching his fleet get destroyed by a force that hit fast and committed completely. He understood now that hesitation in a corridor like this was the thing that killed you, not the rocks, the flinching. He did not flinch. When his group emerged on the underside of the installation and hit the power relays with everything they had, the effect rolled through the structure like a wave. The defensive guns on the primary face flickered and died. The Vendra ships docked at the structure broke formation and tried to respond in 2 directions at once. Helm's voice came through on the fleet channel immediately. All ships push through, now. The combined human and coalition fleet drove into the gap together. The fight that followed was not clean. It was not the kind of battle that looked elegant on a tactical display. It was close, brutal, and loud with damage reports. The Iron Wall took 3 hits that would have crippled a lesser ship. Brower's Stonewall lost its secondary drives again and had to be towed clear by another vessel. Brix's Reliant Oath took a direct hit to its forward section and kept firing through it. 40 minutes after the first shot, the Vendra staging ground went dark. Not damaged, not retreating. The structure lost power entirely, life support included. The docked Vendra ships attempted to scatter, but the human ships were already in position around the exit corridors. The ones that surrendered were let through. The ones that didn't were stopped. When it was over, Osai sat in the quiet of the Iron Wall's bridge and listened to the damage reports come in. 2 human ships were mission killed, 11 crew dead, 43 injured. Every other ship in the fleet was damaged to some degree. None of them had left the engagement early. She thought about the 31 systems the Vendra had taken in 6 weeks. She thought about the families in those systems, the ones who were still alive, who would have more time now. She decided the math was acceptable. 3 days later, she stood in the real Coalition Council chamber. Not a hologram this time. She had made the trip in person, partly out of respect, and partly because she wanted to look Veth in the eye when he said whatever he was going to say. He thanked her for a long time. He used many formal words. He spoke about the debt the Coalition owed humanity, about the historic nature of the partnership, about the future of interspecies cooperation. When he finished, she replied simply. "We didn't come here for a debt," she said. "We came because someone asked for help and we were able to give it. That's what species do when they want to share a galaxy. You don't send a bill for that." Veth looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in a quieter voice than the formal one, "Why did you answer? The signal was not meant for you. Many would have said it was not their problem." Osai thought about the engineer who had grown up poor on a colony and built receivers that listened to dead frequencies. She thought about Brower holding the line on a damaged ship, because 3 more minutes was what was needed. She thought about Brix threading a debris corridor in the dark, because he had decided that hesitation was the thing that killed you. "Because someone was dying and we had the power to help," she said. "There's no version of that situation where we stay home." Kar-El wrote his final report to the council that evening. He spent a long time on the last paragraph. He rewrote it 4 times. The final version read, "Do not fear that humans build warships. Do not fear how many they have or how well they use them. Fear only this, the day you call for help and they do not come. That is the only version of humanity that should worry you, and based on everything I have observed, it is also the least likely." 47 ships jumped home the next morning. Same formation they had arrived in. Orderly, tight, deliberate. The damaged ones in the center, the intact ones on the outside. Nobody left behind. From the observation deck of the Coalition station, Brix watched them go. His daughter had sent him a message that morning. She had successfully completed her first solo flight. She had written that she wanted to be a fleet captain someday. He wrote back and told her that sounded like an excellent idea. Then he went to find Osai, because she had told him before she left that if he ever wanted to talk about formation tactics, she knew a good frequency to reach her on. He had a lot of questions.